University of Mannheim for the Tax Justice Network. I think I have to click here quickly. And I'm very, very happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm happy to be here and present in front of you. I am from the finance department in Mannheim, so it's very helpful to get comments from a little broader audience. And so whenever you have a comment, a question, a critique, please just interrupt me when I go. Yes, so I start with this picture. I think you all had some minutes already now to look at this picture and calculate more or less how much your body is worth. So this presentation will be telling us, or I will be speaking about, that most of us are in a very privileged position to never think about how much money we can make out of our organs. But more importantly, this presentation will be about how much money can actually be made from organs. And I try to show you that this money, this big amount of money which can be made from organs, is used by criminal groups in order to finance their attacks. So this is the project Guns and Kidneys, how transplant tourism finances global conflict. So I start with a question, how non-state armed groups finance their activity. And when I say non-state armed groups, I mean any group which uses violent means to fight its aims, but which is not directly financed by a state. And just for this project, you rather think about smaller non-state groups, because this is the focus of the project. So it's not so much about Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is also in my data set, but it's very much more about small local militias. Small groups who are armed, who are violent, and who try to fight their aims with violent means. Yes.
Are you able to do the line between state and non-state?
That's a very good question, because it's hard to do. And I actually don't do it myself, because I just let the doers of my data set decide. So I have a data set where the people who constructed the data set distinguish between state groups and non-state groups, and I just follow their definition. So I think that definition is that it's not a group which is officially called a state, or which is officially made up by a state. So I think, for example, you will have groups which might be financed partly by a state, which might be financed by Iran, for example, but not a group which is really part of the Iranian military.
So Wagner is a non-state.
Yes.
Okay.
I guess. Okay. Thanks for the question.
It is a financial definition, or it is a legal definition?
Good question. I think these are very important questions. I already noticed that I'm not precise enough here. I think it's a more legal definition, because the data set is coming from, it's a political science data set, and I'm just applying it. And it has groups which are legally independent, which the state would not say this is our group. Okay, so of course there is already literature on how these non-state armed groups finance their activities. So there's a descriptive paper by Makarenko from 2004, who kind of described how non-state armed groups use robbery, use theft, use smuggling, use fraud and kidnapping in order to finance their activities. There's a recent econometrica paper by Nicolas Lemodio, who shows how donations are used to finance criminal activities by non-state groups. Then I think the third point, which is something which is also shown in FATF report, this is something which we are all well aware of since the importance of ISIL, that non-state armed groups use oil and gas resources to finance their activities. And there's a recent AER paper by Berman et al. From 2017, who showed that non-state armed groups finance their activity via mining activity. This means that this is just focusing on Africa, and shows how non-state armed groups actually use the revenues from mining in order to finance attacks. So what I try to add to this literature is to show that non-state armed groups also finance their attacks via organ trade. So why do I think that organ trade could be relevant here? I actually think so because also security agencies consider this a relevant aspect, and they are concerned that illegal organ trade could actually be used to finance non-state violent activities. And just to illustrate this concern, I brought this woman with me. She's called Dr. Shelley. And here in this picture, you see her in a hearing in the House of Representatives in the Committee on Homeland Security. This was in 2016, and Dr. Shelley talked about the recent trend in terrorist financing. So she's an expert in terrorist financing. She's coming from the Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center at George Mason. And in this hearing in the Committee on Homeland Security, she said the following on the current trends for terrorist financing. So Dr. Shelley said, I want to mention folky areas of illicit trade that I think of as relatively new and that are not being paid enough attention to. One type of new trade I wanted to discuss is that of the kidney trade. For quite a number of years, there has been a trade in, for example, Egypt, in which wealthy foreigners come and are operated on in hospitals, obtaining kidneys that they cannot legitimately obtain in the United States or Western Europe. What makes this a problem of terrorist finance is that it appears that this trade has become so lucrative that armed groups are intimidating the doctors who have traditionally performed this trade and are taking many of the profits out of this trade. And what has also changed is that the purchasers of the kidneys are no longer bringing suitcases of dollars to Egypt, but are putting the money through wire transfers and transfers to travel agencies into bank accounts in Western Europe, France, the United Kingdom, and Germany. So when Dr. Shelley says that, she's mainly basing this concern on anecdotal evidence, on newspaper articles, and on some survey evidence from anthropologists. And what I try to do in this paper is to investigate systematically if armed groups finance their attacks by illegal organ trade. So what do I do in particular? So I investigate the impact of organ trafficking on local conflict, and I use georeference data on conflict events and hand-collected data on the local transplant infrastructure. I also use exogenous variation in kidney demand, and therefore I use the US waiting list patients for kidneys, their payment capacity, and their physical conditions. And I then investigate how this demand for organs, so this demand for kidneys in the US, what kind of impact does it have in other countries? So let's say we are in the US, there's a higher kidney demand, and now we look into India, and we compare the effect of this higher kidney demand in a locality in India where you can do transplants with a locality in India where you cannot do transplants. And I look at these different localities, how the conflict changes, or how the attacks of non-state armed groups change. I will go more into detail, of course, in this method later. But to summarize already, I find that higher kidney demand increases conflict in localities with a transplant infrastructure outside of the US, but not so in localities without a transplant infrastructure. And to just give some numbers on this, I find that a 1 standard deviation increase in the US waiting list for kidneys leads to an increase in the probability of conflict by 17% in those localities where you can do transplanting as compared to the localities where you cannot do transplanting. And I also find that a 1 standard deviation increase in the US waiting list for kidneys leads to an increase in the number of attacks in those localities where you can do transplanting by 1%. And always compared to localities without a transplant infrastructure. I then focus on the groups. So I look at those non-state armed groups who have access to transplant centers and compare them to them who do not have this access. And I show that armed groups with a transplant infrastructure at their home region increase their probability of performing an attack and increase their number of attacks when kidney demand in the US is higher. However, those non-state armed groups in India, for example, who do not have a transplant center in the home region, they do not increase the probability or the number of attacks in reaction to the higher US kidney demand. And finally, I show that higher kidney demand is associated with an increase in suspicious payments from and to countries known for illegal transplanting. So this is just a summary of my project. And before I go more into details on my project, on the analysis, on the results, and so on, I would like to give some background on the organ market, just in case. I know some of you know the organ markets way better than I do, but some of you might not be so aware of organ markets, so I would like to give some background here. Okay, so coming to the organ market. So organ markets, like almost all other markets, are composed of supply and demand. So we have the demand, and the demand is coming from people who need an organ because they have some malfunctioning, or because they don't have the organ, they are in need of a new organ. This is the demand side. On the supply side, we have both living and deceased donors. So the living donors are those who give, or there are some organs where you can do a living donation, for example, the kidney. So I have 2 kidneys and I can live very well with only 1 kidney. So I could just give away one of my kidneys when I'm still alive and continue to live. And another person who is in need of a kidney could just continue living with my kidney. The same is true for parts of the liver, but for most of the other organs, I can just donate them when I have died. And there the supply is composed of deceased donors, which in most parts of the world are people who somehow in their lifetime agreed to be a deceased donor. And if then I die in a special way, so they can use, for example, my heart, then my heart can be donated to a person who needs this organ. So this is like in most other markets, we have demand supply. However, unlike in most other markets, in almost all countries of the world, it's strictly forbidden to freely exchange organs. So even though I could donate my kidney, I cannot just go to anybody of you and tell you, please take my kidney, give me $100,000 US. This is forbidden in almost all countries of the world. Instead, and this is again true for almost all countries of the world, these countries have established so-called waiting lists. So if, for example, I need a kidney and none of my relatives or close friends can give me this kidney, then I can ask the official administration, in my case, the German administration or the German office for that, to put my name on the waiting list. Then my name will be on the waiting list for kidneys, and according to some politically determined algorithm, I will get a kidney when it's my turn. And this can depend on how old I am, how good the matching is, some other mechanisms, and I think Peter can tell you a lot about these things. So this is true, like I said, for almost all countries in the world, also for the US. And what is also true for almost all countries in the world in this organ market is that demand highly exceeds supply. So this is something you can see in this picture. Here in dark gray, I show the waiting list additions to the US waiting list for kidney in 2021. So those are the people, not for kidneys, sorry, for different organs. Those are the people who enter the waiting list, people who add up to the waiting list because they also want to have an organ. And it's shown for kidney, liver, heart, lung, and other organs. As a comparison, here I show in light gray, in a second, the transplants performed in 21. This is in light gray. So when the dark ones are the ones who come new to the list, the light grays are the ones who leave the list successfully. Those who really get the organ which they wish. There was a question?
It's probably not very much related to what you're doing, but it seems to me interesting that the rate at which the waiting list exceeds the actual transplantation for some reason is like inversely proportional to the invasiveness of the surgery. And do you have any idea why is that? So I would have expected that it's much easier to supply kidneys or transplant kidneys than it is to transplant lungs. But somehow the actual transplantations are a much larger share of the waiting list for lungs than for kidneys.
True. I don't know, but it's an interesting observation. I think what is maybe true for kidney, but correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's just more flow in general. So, I mean, yeah, there are many people coming in. I think especially in highly developed country, kidney diseases increase a lot. So I guess maybe it's just because there are many people coming, but yeah, good observation. And I actually think I should find out for next time.
Also kidneys, you can go to dialysis, so you can survive with a kidney failure, but not with a lung or heart failure. So these are very different, I guess. And also in kidney, you also have this possibility of living donation, which is not possible for heart and lung. So either it's partly possible, but there are big differences.
Yeah, but still, I think interesting observation. Okay, and what you see here is for the US, for example, but as I said, that's true for almost all countries in the world, is that those who come new to the waiting list are way more than those who leave the list successfully. For example, for kidneys in the US, if I enter the waiting list now, I have a 1 in 3 chance to obtain a kidney by legal means. If I go to all of these organs, again for the US, half of the people will die on the waiting list before they receive an organ. If it's worldwide, it's even worse, of course. So the WHO estimates that out of 10 patients who will need an organ, only 1 person will receive this organ by legal means. So I think for us as economists, it's not so surprising that this has meant that a very big black market has emerged for organs. So there's a very big black market which has emerged for organs. And I will show you on this slide that this is not only a black market, but it's also a global market. This is the global market for kidneys here. From now on, I will focus on kidneys because kidneys are the most important part for the global markets. It's estimated that about 67% of illegal organ markets are about kidneys, and therefore kidneys will also be the focus of my papers. I think it makes sense, and this is again because kidneys can be transplanted by living persons. So if you want to have some illegal business here, and I will go more into detail on this later, this is of course easy because people can donate their kidney and get some money, and you don't really need to kill people what you would need to do with a heart or so. So this is why I focus on kidneys, and this is also shown here, the global market for kidneys. So how does this market work? So we have, I hope the colors can be seen here. So we have a typical donor here. Let's start with a typical recipient. We have a typical recipient here. This typical recipient is about 48 years old, male, and has an annual income of $53,000 US. So you see that these numbers are kind of an average of those anecdotal evidence we have on this business. This typical recipient comes from one of these countries, which are depicted in blue here. This is where most of these anecdotal newspaper cases have been talking about. And a typical recipient does not get a kidney by legal means in his own country, and therefore he travels to one of these countries shown in red. So the typical recipient will travel to one of the red countries, go to a transplantation hospital there, get a kidney there, pay some money, and then he flies back to his own home. He never meets the person who donated this kidney. On the other side, you have this typical donor who is usually younger than 30 years old, also mostly male, and has an annual income of about $480 US. The typical donor lives in one of these countries which are shown in red here. And the typical donor has been recruited by some local guy, and he goes to the transplantation hospital, gets the money, gives the kidney, goes home again. As I said, the two people never meet. What is important now and what is interesting for my project is if you ask the typical recipient, how much did you pay for getting this kidney? The typical recipient will tell you that he paid between $100,000 and $200,000 US for the kidney. However, if you go to the average donor and ask this donor, how much did you receive for your kidney? The typical donor reports that he receives between $500 US up to $10,000 US. So what you see here is that there's a very, very, very big profit margin in between. Of course, this margin has to be used to somehow pay the doctors, pay the hospitals, bribe some people, and so on, but there's a lot of money to be made. So those who organize all the trade, this means inviting the foreigners, doing some advertisement somewhere, bribing the local authorities, collaborating with the hospitals, collaborating with the doctors, recruiting donors from the local villages. These people can really make a very big profit. And my hypothesis here is that the non-state violent groups are either assuming the role of a broker themselves or working together with the brokers in this business.
how do we know all these data that you mentioned? This is a black market.
So for this one, we don't really know the data well. So this is just, like I said, statistics compiled from anecdotal evidence, newspaper evidence. For my project, I will show you in a second how I kind of use legal measures and also in order to estimate illegal stuff. And the main idea here, and I will come to this, I think, in 3 or 4 slides, is based on the observation that most of the detected schemes of transplant tourism were happening in legal hospitals. So you have a hospital which is always doing transplantation, which has a legal authorization to do transplantations, but then in the night, on the weekend, they do some illegal stuff in addition. And most of the reported cases are based on this. And though I cannot observe where illegal transplantations are done, I can assume that illegal transplantations are more done where there is a transplant center as compared to a place where we don't have a transplant center. And that's the core idea of this analysis. And of course, it involves some assumptions, and I guess we can discuss more on this as soon as I come to this core idea. Okay, so let's come to this hypothesis. Like I said, I assume that non-state armed groups actually rip off some of the profits which can be made from transplant tourism. And the mechanism I suggest is like the following. I start from the notion that armed groups are financially constrained, which is something which is also shown by the Sterling et al. Paper. And I claim, or I hypothesize, that they use organ trafficking, in particular these transplant tourism agreements, to finance attacks. So the more organs they can sell and the higher the price of these organs, the higher the probability that they perform an attack. I mean, I have a very obvious reverse causality problem here, because war zones are a major target for organ recruitment and create organ demand at the same time. So of course, when there's war, there are many people who are dead, there's much chaos, so you can easily steal organs from people. Also, where there's war, there are many attacks, there are many injured people. Also, the need for organs is very high, so it would be problematic to analyze the correlation just within these zones of conflict. So this is the reverse causality problem. So the more conflicts happen, the more organs can be acquired and the more organs are needed. In order to solve this reverse causality problem, I use exogenous organ demand from the US. So I use the US waiting list for kidney transplants to have an estimate of this organ demand coming from the rich countries. And then, like I said before, I compare the effect of this higher organ demand from the US in countries or in localities outside the US. And I always compare a locality, for example, in India, I compare a locality where transplanting is possible with a locality where transplanting is not possible. And I look at how in these different localities, conflict is affected by a higher kidney demand. I choose these localities only in countries which are known for this transplant tourism agreements.
So I'm here as an expert of this kidney transplantation, but so you say that the more conflicts there are, the demand for organs is increasing. So is it the case that sometimes the kidney transplantation is needed because of an injury, so that it's more like chronic disease?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Maybe, maybe I should be more precise here, because maybe you're right, and actually injuries won't create any kidney in need, but more kidney supply. Yeah, but let me check that. Yeah, because I'm also on this whole organ part, I'm also not so well read, but I think you're right. I think you're right. I don't know if there are some things which happen or where you need a new organ because of an accident, but yes.
Just it's yesterday's news that in the US, if there is a water gathering, then there is an increase in kidney transplantation.
If there's a water gathering?
If there is a water gathering, I mean,
Okay. Yeah.
there is a
Easy
easy riders come to.
Yeah. This is because
So then it could be some sort of checking for the robustness of your results, because then in the US you might also do this sort of same exercise in a way that perhaps this is something which drives those results as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very good idea. Yeah, thanks.
So how do you know that organ demand in the US is exogenous? So maybe it is already a decision whether I want to get myself on the waiting list. If my doctor says that it's hopeless to get, then I'm just not going to get myself on the waiting list.
True. I think I maybe should rephrase here. It's not exogenous to everything, but it's exogenous to a local conflict happening in urban India. That's what I would say.
So maybe doctors in the US are also aware of what these patients are doing. And maybe if they know that there is a conflict here, then there is going to be an increase in supply. So it makes sense to get yourself on the waiting list, because even if not through the legal route, but maybe you can just.
True. I think that's a mechanism which so far could also drive my results. That's correct. Yeah. So, but then we would really need to have these doctors who are in the US are well aware of what's happening in India. But yes, if you have these doctors who say, okay, you have this region in India, there are many conflicts, these people will buy some organs for you from the people they kill. Yeah. Was there another question?
I think the organ you were quite clear how the organ markets work, but it's not clear for me how these are grouped first. For example, I understand that if there is an increased demand for kidneys, then they get money, but it's not perfectly true for me. That's how it affects the activities on the short and on the longer term. For example, if the leader of these groups get a lot of money, perhaps they want to have a vacation on Havae instead of killing additional people in the neighborhood. And I guess these organizations do not have very sophisticated intertemporal budget constraint and optimization, but still it's not clear for me how it should affect them on the short term and on the longer term.
That's a very good question. I've been struggling a lot with the question, and this is the question on timing, right? Like when should we even see effects? How does this money come in? Is this rather random or not? And here I base my work kind of entirely on this permanent article. I also use the same method as they do. And what they argue is the group actually has many planned attacks. They would like to do as many attacks as they wish. And I think this makes sense for some of these groups, which are really local militias who try to attack there and here and have this and that. But they need to have a money inflow in order to commit the attack, really. So they have planned all kinds of attack, but then they need to pay somebody. So, for example, somebody who blows himself up, they need to pay this person. They need to obtain weapons. They just need money to really perform attacks, which they anyways wanted to do. And then the idea would be that they kind of use the opportunity when somebody is coming and then perform an attack which they anyways wanted to commit. And this should be something which should be seen in my sample. However, the problem remains when this should be actually happening, because I don't even know when the payment is made. I don't know if they pay in advance, if they pay later. That's hard to see from the anecdotal evidence. I don't know when how these groups pay. So do they pay the family of a suicide bomber before or after, and so on? So there are several stories which are also contradicting. So how I dealt with that in my research is I just used very different specification. In this one, which I will explain you in a second, I just used the same month. So this is the idea. They really want to commit an attack. They have somebody who does it, who says, yes, but please pay me that and that amount, or a group of soldiers who say, yes, but we need to have this amount to commit the attack. So the same month where the kidney demand goes up, which kind of proxies for people who will travel, who have traveled a month ago, who will travel in the next month, and so on. And I look in the same month. However, I have the same results if I aggregate this on a yearly basis. And I also have the same result if I look at kidney demand in, let's say, January of 22. And then I look at the conflict in the entire following years. So I use a rolling window and then I look at, okay, we have kidney demand of that and that amount in January 22. And if I aggregate all the conflicts which happened from January 22 to January 23, then I also get the same results. Mm-hmm. But yes, this is something which I'm very vague about because I also don't know. And because the evidence which I found is not always showing in the same direction.
And do you know what these militias do besides killing and attacking other people? So if they get a lot of money, they can spend a lot of things.
I mean, I have in this database which I use, I have all kinds of conflicts. So anything conflict related I have, for example, I have the information if they do a demonstration, I of course exclude this from the sample. I have the information if they do some looting, I also exclude that. But I wouldn't have information on other activities. Let's say they establish a business, then I don't see.
What about poachers?
Sorry?
Poachers.
What does it mean?
When they are just getting the endangered species and trade with them.
Ah, yeah, this also happens. This is something, I think this would just be an alternative mechanism how these groups finance themselves in addition to the organ trade. Just to make that clear, I'm not saying that they only finance themselves by organ trade, these groups. It's just one out of the mechanisms. I would also never claim that it's the most important mechanism. I just think that it's a mechanism which some groups who have the opportunity to use it in their own locality.
For example, could you measure somehow local corruption? For example, they may spend additional money to bribe local officials.
I can't do that in my current setting. I will explain you in a second why, because I don't use I use localities by doing a grid over the world. So I don't use local administrative boundaries. So I don't have corruption data, but I think I could move that to another level where I could somehow include this. But then, of course, I would also need this on a varying level for each locality because I try to be very fine-grained. My localities at the moment, and I will explain in a moment, 55 kilometers times 55 kilometers, so a rather small cell. And of course, I would need to get corruption data on this level, in particular for the countries, which are my sample countries, which mainly includes India and Pakistan. And there I might get this on the country level, of course, but I'm not so sure if I can get it on this very small grained local level. But I guess what would be possible, and I might just also write that down, so thanks for the hint, is to have some interaction to look if it's stronger, or if in a country where this is happening a lot, if we see a higher corruption there. So, because I think the link to corruption is very obvious. Okay, coming to my main specification, like I explained very shortly now. So I look at localities, I said it already, and I completely copy or I use this approach suggested by Bernd et al. In the AR paper, where they do the very same for non-state armed groups in African countries. And I do a grid over all the sample countries of my analysis. So I put a grid and I end up with 0.5 latitude times 0.5 longitude cells. So I have these cells which are spread all over my sample countries. I prefer this over using administrative boundaries because these boundaries themselves could be endogenous to conflict events. So it's better to just have these cells which are fixed and which are just making these 55 kilometers times 55 kilometer cell. And I look at these cells. And then I look for each of the cells. If we have a conflict in the given cell, in the given month T, like I said before, I play around a little with this T and also have some other specification, which I will not show here, but which have the same results. And I regress this conflict variable on the interaction between the information if in a given cell I, we have a transplant infrastructure. This is the information if there's an authorized transplant center in cell I, and I interact this transplant infrastructure with the US kidney demand at month T. Like I said before, I proxy, or the transplant infrastructure here is for official transplant center, and for my analysis, this makes sense if most of these illegal transplants also happen at these legal transplant centers. Then I include cell fixed effects, and I include month fixed effects. And this means that with this regression, I compare the effect of a higher kidney demand on conflict between a cell of the same country, which has a transplant infrastructure, compared to a cell which does not have a transplant infrastructure. And here, because this is on spatial analysis, I use some corrected standard errors, or I use Conley standard errors, which are corrected for spatial and temporal autocorrelation. So this means that if I have two cells which are next to each other, I assume that the errors of these two cells could be correlated. And within one cell over time, I also assume that the error could be correlated throughout my sample period. Okay, let's come a little more to the data. First of all, how do I get the conflict events? I use the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, ARCLET. And this is a project which has compiled real-time data on locations, dates, actors, fatalities, and types of all reported political violence and protest events across the world. And as I said before, from them I also take the information if this is a state or a non-state group. And for sure, thanks for the hint here, I have to look more into how they actually do this definition because I should know about the project. And out of these events, out of these conflict events, I only include violent events of non-state actors. And I exclude those kind of events which really don't need financing. Like if you do a protest, yes, you need financing, but not so much. And I also exclude events like looting, where you also don't need external financing. Then I construct two different dependent variables. First, I have a conflict dummy, which is a dummy indicating if at least one conflict event happened in a cell in a given month. And I use the number of conflict events by the log sum of all events in a cell in a given month. Yes?
What are conflicts exactly?
Sorry?
What are these conflicts exactly?
What?
The conflicts itself.
Yeah, it's mostly, for example, attack against civilians. It's a fight with another non-state groups. It's a fight against the state group, which has been initiated by the non-state groups. That's the most of it. And suicide attacks.
Mm-hmm. And all of them has a cause of fatality?
Not all of them, but most of them. I also do the same analysis with fatalities.
Mm-hmm.
I think the definition is that they either have fatalities or are as severe that they could have had a fatality.
Thanks.
There was another question, I think.
Almost the same.
Okay. So just that you get an idea of how these conflicts look like. Here you see them in a heat map. It's a little hard to see on this projector now, but the stronger this purple is, the more conflicts happen in a given part. Here, for example, you have India, Pakistan, here we have Argentina, here we have Russia, and here we have South Africa. I will come to the sample countries of my analysis later. What you also see here are these red dots, and these are the transplant centers. So you see how they are distributed spatially in my analysis. Okay, that's the second important variable, the transplant infrastructure. So this, you can think about this as a treatment condition. This is if we have a transplant cell. So if in this local cell, there is a transplant infrastructure. And this is just a dummy variable indicating if in this 0.5 degrees times 0.5 degrees cell, there's at least one authorized transplant center. And I got these transplant center by a hand collection. So I just either looked at the Ministry of Health website to get the list of all these authorized transplant centers. And for some of the countries, I had to contact the Ministry of Health in order to get this list. And then I just did a Google map search to locate them on my map. Then we have the variable kidney demand. This is coming from the United Network of Organ Sharing Standard Transplant Analysis and Research file. It's also called National UNOSTAR file. And this file entails information on all waiting list registrations and transplant that have been listed or performed in the US since October 1987. And I aggregate this to have a monthly figure on how many patients are actually on the waiting list for kidneys. I construct three variables here, and I will later tell you why I use these different variables. First, I just take the total number of waiting list patients, so the total number of people on the US waiting list for a kidney in a given month. I then look at the subset of all those waiting list patients on dialysis. So the number of people who are on dialysis in a given month, I will say to this a little more in 3 or 4 slides. And I also look at the subset of those waiting list patients who have a labor income when entering the waiting list. So I end up with about 16,000 cells in 5 countries, and I select those 5 countries by the fact that they have some transplant tourism activity according to anecdotal evidence in newspaper articles, and only those countries where I have an official government list of the transplant centers or transplant hospitals. So the 5 countries are India, Pakistan, South Africa, Argentina, and Russia.
Yeah, so just about your previous slide. So actually you can rule out this potential problem that I mentioned very easily, because if you identify if you use just the number of patients in dialysis, that's going to rule out the
Yeah.
problem that I mentioned, because nobody's going to get dialysis in that mistake.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Maybe with these
That's
arguments.
so.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thanks for the. Okay, and then I look at, oh, sorry.
Yeah, and on the other slide, you wrote that you have information on the authors of these violent activities. And I'm wondering how you can differentiate between some kind of armed robber gang from local mafia or much better organized regions or religious or separatist army, basically.
Yeah, I mean, in the data set, you only have political violence. So just total criminal group is not in there. So it's just political violence. And if you look at, I have this for later, but I will just show you now because it fits to the question. Most of the groups are like this. I just did some of the groups, I have like, I think 700, but they're most these communal militia. So for here, for example, so you have this National Army, I don't know, but then you have the communal militia from here, the communal militia from there, the communal militia from here. So these are communal militias who have some specific goal which they fight for in their own locality. And this is really the big part of the observation. Here I just selected those the first ones for starting with M. And this is also true for most of the countries. So you have them for Pakistan, for South Africa here. And so most of the groups, I've looked at all of the groups because I had to Google all of the groups, but and for sure all of them are involved in political violence, but you are right that they might have different organizational structure. And for sure they are very different in their size and so on. And for sure for some of them, the sum you can get from organ trade is very high, and for others the sum is not so high. So I guess that's.
You also have data from Brazil and Russia. Are there also some kind of political militias as well?
Especially Russia.
Russia? Yeah, I have to look up the group. I mean, I have to admit now, like last time I presented, I even had Hungary in the sample because there's one newspaper article in Hungary, and then I just did all the countries which have this transplant tourism activity, and then you have sometimes these very, sometimes some far extremist group. You have for Germany, you also have several entries, and for Hungary, you had some entries of some political killings. But for Russia, I would need to look it up. Yes, I didn't look up the groups now. I deleted some countries where it became obvious that it doesn't really make sense. But yes, I should maybe also look up Russia. Okay, let's come to the first results. So what I show here is the results from the regression of the conflict dummy on the interaction between the transplant center and the number of waiting list patients. Let's only focus on this thing for a second. So in this first regression, I include cell and month fixed effects. And in the second regression, I, in addition, also include country times month fixed effects to control for anything what is happening on a country month level in the different countries. And I do find that in the cell with a transplant center, the conflict probability increases from 5.5%. This is the base probability of 550 basis points in transplant cell. And this increases by 93 basis points to 6.4% in the locality with a transplant center as compared to the locality without a transplant center. And the same result remains if I include country times month fixed effects. So here, these are standardized coefficients. So I standardized this waiting list variable. So this is why we can interpret this increase from 5.5% to 6.4% as what happens when the number of waiting list patients increases by one standard deviation. Then I thought a little more about this whole transplant tourism thing. And my first thought was, not everyone can involve in this. Not everyone can really go and pay 100 to 200,000 US dollars to get a kidney. And therefore, I look at only those patients who indicate when they enter the waiting list that they have a labor income. I would have liked to see the wealth of these patients, of course, I cannot because that's not in the data, but I now look at only the subset of patients who have a labor income when entering the waiting list. And as both of these coefficients are standardized, we can actually compare them here. And we see that for the subset of patients with an income, coefficients get way higher. And in a cell with a transplant center, the conflict probability increases from 5.5% to 8% with a one standard deviation increase in waiting list patients with income. Then I had a third thought. It's not only that you need to be rich to do this, you also need to be healthy enough to do this. You need to go to an airport, you need to take a plane, you need to go to some other country where you go in a hospital you've never been to, and you need to go through all of these things. So this is only possible if you have a certain health condition which allows you to do so. And what information I have on these people on the waiting list is if they are on dialysis. So dialysis is thing of blood clearing, which you need to go through if you have a kidney malfunctioning. So if you are at this stage of the disease, which is normally a later stage of kidney disease, you need to go to dialysis normally 3 times a week for 3 or 4 hours. So you need to go there several days a week. You need to stay there for several hours. And this means that you can actually not do this whole travel. And in line with this argument, if I just look at the subset of patients on dialysis, we do not find any significant effect on the probability of having a conflict in a given month. I do the very same looking at the number of conflicts. So this was the probability of conflict. This is the number of conflicts. And we find the same in a cell with a transplant center. The number of conflict events increases by 0.9% with a 1 standard deviation in waiting list patients. This is log conflict events. Therefore, we can interpret it as percentages. It increases by 1.8% with a 1 standard deviation increase in waiting list patients with income, and not significantly for those waiting list patients on dialysis. So we see that this happens on the local level if you look at the cell, but now of course I was interested if transplant tourism really increases the fighting capabilities of the armed groups. So I would like to go look at the different armed groups instead of looking at the different localities now. And here I make the assumption that armed groups mainly benefit from the transplant tourism in their home region. I think this assumption is valid because as a local militia, you can actually involve very well in this thing. So you know this hospital, you might know the doctors, you know the community, you also have trust in the community. And these are all things which these local militia have. This is what political science research show. And these people have these capacities, which means that they can easily involve in this whole transplant tourism business, or even set up the transplant tourism business. And therefore, I assume that whenever a group has a transplant tourism in their home region, this is the group which can do this business, and a group which does not have transplant tourism in the home region cannot do this business.
Is it possible that the armed group was the one that built the clinic in the first place? Because sometimes it happens that they are providing.
That could be possible. That could be possible. I'm not so sure because at least for India, where most of the radiation comes from India, the health ministry is quite strict on them. Like some of them also lose their, it cannot be super strict because then these cases would not happen anymore. But I think that at least the government has to give the authorization. But yes, they could also build this, which wouldn't really go, which would just be a slightly different interpretation from what I have so far. So the regression I estimate now is the conflict of the armed group J at time t, and these armed group J as a little more or near to 800 non-state armed groups, and I identify if they have a transplant center at home, when they have a transplant center in the cell where the group is based, or where the group has its head. So where the group is based is a little general. So I said either where the group has the headquarters, or where the group was founded, or what is the cell of ethnic origin of the group. And I hand collected this transplant center at home variable for these 769 non-state armed groups. I look at conflict of this group. So has this group performed an attack in a given month T? And I regress it on the interaction if they have a transplant center at their home. And the kidney demand in the US, I include group fixed effects and time fixed effects. And here I kind of compare a group which has a transplant center at home with a group which does not have a transplant center at home. So let's look at the result. If, again, we look at the group's probability of conflict, so this is a dummy if the group has been involved in a conflict in a given month, we regress it on the interaction between transplant center and the number of waiting list patients, we find that the probability of conflict of a group with a transplant center at its home region increases from 2.2%, the base probability here, to 2.5%, if you add these 28 basis points with a 1 standard deviation increase in waiting list patients. Again, coefficients are double as high for waiting list patients with income and are non-significant for waiting list patients on dialysis. The same for the number of conflict events. We see that the number of conflict events of a group with a transplant center at home increases by 0.2% with a 1 standard deviation increase in waiting list patients, and by 0.7% with a 1 standard deviation increase in waiting list patient with income. So now I was interested if these groups do only increase the conflict in their own region. So let's say they have a transplant center in their own region. Do they only increase the attacks there? Or does the violence also spread over space? And in order to investigate that, I now only look at those conflicts, those attacks, which the group has performed outside of the home cell. So this would mean they have the home cell, they have the transplant center there, for sure they do more attacks here, but maybe they also spread out and do even more attacks in other cells. And this is exactly what I find. What you see here is a group's probability of conflict outside of the own home region, again, regressed on the interaction between a transplant center at the home region and the waiting list patients. And we find that the probability of having a conflict outside the home region of a group with a transplant center at the home region increases from 1.6%, again, the base probability, to 1.9% with a 1 standard deviation increase in waiting list patients. These are these coefficients. And from 1.6% to 2.1% with a 1 standard deviation increase in waiting list patients with income. Again, results are insignificant for waiting list patients on dialysis. We find the same results for the number of conflict events outside the home region. And now I come to the very last short analysis. And this is the question if transplant tourism is actually associated with suspicious payments. So, there's a question.
I keep wondering that do you know anything about this waiting list, the length of the waiting list depends on. So is it present about the seasonality or is it?
I will just show you because I also didn't know, I just had a look at the data. So what is relevant for me here, so if you look at the waiting list in general, you'll see that it's quite flat, which is not so good for my analysis because there should be some variation, right? But what matters for me, as I look at the local, at the monthly level, and I include month mixed effects, is the monthly changes, and you see that they vary quite a lot. So you see that the solid line is all waiting list patients, the dashed line, the one on dialysis, and the dotted line with labor income. And you see that they vary kind of. You also see that we seem to have a structural break here at 2015. And therefore, I also do the analysis separated for the beginning and for the end, just to check and nothing changes. But yes, I think if your question was a little hinting on, is this variation really enough to find what we want to find? I would say that's also a big question of mine and I don't know. And I guess it's also one of, I would say this is the main weakness of the paper, of the project. Okay, let's go to the suspicious payments. Now I look at if transplant tourism is associated with suspicious payments, because as I said in the beginning, what Dr. Shelley says is that people are not paying with cash anymore, but they will just use the legal banking system for that. And I have some slight indications for this, but I guess that's the analysis which has to be taken with most caution. So I look at the suspicious payments now. And I have to go to a country level to do so because this is the only level where you get information.
I'm not sharing your slides anymore.
No, shit.
Okay, sorry for that.
Oh.
What? I think we lost internet connection.
Okay, should I wait or continue? Or?
Actually, can I have a question in the meantime?
Yes, sure.
So if I understand correctly, this whole thing is led by patients who are wealthy and not that sick, right?
Yes.
So I would think that these are the people who actually have time to wait because they are just not that sick. And going to a third world country where you wouldn't even do the tap water or the kidney transplant seems to be a bit risky to me.
True,
especially for those who are not in that much of a need because they are just not that sick.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think there are two things which you can say there. First, waiting will not necessarily help. You will just get sicker and you might still not get a transplant, but yes, that's still a point. And I think the second thing is, and this is something I still need to think about more because I tried to see the implications, what it has on the entire research, is that research on those people in the US who actually are recipients show that many people have ties to the countries. So for example, US Americans with some distant Indian roots might go to India, are more probable to go to India. Like this has been shown most for the connection to China. And China is a very specific case because there was a state organized donation program, you could say. But for China, you could see that US citizens with Chinese roots, they would use this service or they would go to China to get transplanted there. And therefore, I think the barrier might be highest for those who have never left the country, let's say. But I guess there are many people who have a lower barrier because they know somebody, and then maybe some relative in India tells you, okay, we know that there's a probability here. So I guess this is also playing in here. But in general, I agree to your point. This just problem maybe.
I think the internet is back. You just have to start sharing again.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So more questions? Not. Yeah.
So first, I think it's again a bit more complicated because some patient can have a second or multiple transplant. So maybe in a short time they will need a new kidney, even though they are not on dialysis. So they have a short time window to get it. And, they know that after losing their kidney, they won't have the chance to do that. The other questions for you is, I suppose that during this COVID lockdowns, this channel was completely shut down, and many other channels also, and maybe there were different routes for corruption, like for vaccines or whatever. But then the question is whether you can maybe also study that period and.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So far my exam period goes until March 2021, which is only due to the fact because this is when I collected the data. But I think it's right. I could just maybe look at what happens in this last year of my observation to see if it just dies. That would be a nice support of my story. If it doesn't, that might question my story. Thank you. It's a good idea. Okay, coming back to the payments. So here I use the number of suspicious payments from and to a given country at a given month. And then I regress this on the interaction between a dummy, if this is a country known for transplant tourism, this is what I call trafficking country here. So that is a country that is involved in organ trafficking according to the WHO. This is a dummy here. And I interact this dummy with the kidney demand, which is the same variable as before. I include country fixed effects and time fixed effects. So here I compare a country which is not known for organ trafficking to a country which is known for organ trafficking. And I look at how the suspicious payments from and to this country react on a higher kidney demand in the US. I use the payments from and to, and not only to the country, because in this anecdotal evidence, there are often many payments going on. Because kind of the group gets a payment or the doctor gets a payment, then another person gets the payment, and the money flow are not so clear. So it just aggregated everything which I could see on this country. Okay, I take the trafficking country dummy from the WHO, and I take the number of suspicious payments from and to a country from the so-called FinCEN files. These are files which have been leaked by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. So they have leaked these files from the FinCEN agency, and the FinCEN agency is the US agency where global banks have to report suspicious payments. So these are the suspicious payments reported by global banks to the US financial crime agency for these payments. And again, I look at this on a monthly level. And here I find that the log suspicious payments indeed go up for the number of waiting list patients, for the trafficking country, but not so for a non-trafficking country.
Is the same countries which you analyzed before?
No, because all these countries which I analyzed before, they are all deemed as being trafficking countries. So they all have a 1 in this dummy. So this is the entire world now. And as I said, I think here, as it's on the country level, I'm still a little suspicious about the results.
But what about if you do this with the high income patients and also with the number of those in dialysis?
I have to still do that.
Okay. But it could be really.
It should be the same, right?
If they show the same pattern.
Yeah, that would be
for
true.
Dialysis
True.
and higher for the high income.
To be completely honest, this part, I don't find it convincing, but I included it because I'm a finance researcher and I want to send the paper to finance conferences, and the rest is political economy. So then I can say I do something for the payments, and I find it interesting, but to be honest, the coefficient is way too high. So I don't know. I don't know what to think. Yeah.
Could you show somehow that there is also reverse causality? That, for example, if some kind of suspicious things are going on between US and India, then the waiting list indeed become shorter in US.
For the payments, you say?
Sorry?
For the payments, you say, or for which?
Yes, or to show that if the waiting list indeed decrease in the US because people move to India for half illegal.
Okay, yeah, good point. This is something which I cannot see, but I have again one graph which kind of goes to this question. And this is, I was wondering, okay, what happens to these people when they leave the waiting list? They cannot officially leave the waiting list. And here you see the different reasons why people leave the waiting list in my sample. So they can either get a deceased donor treatment, living donor treatment, and so on. So this is the reasons why they are deleted from the waiting list. And I have identified at least 5 points where these people could be subsumed. Died because at one point they will die, even though they get the transplant. Other, which is super suspicious anyways. Unable to contact candidate condition improved without further reasoning, and inactive for 2+ years. So I think if you just don't really react to them anymore, they will be happy because anyways, they have so many people waiting for the organ. So I think this is what could be happening, but what I do not see is how the waiting list really reacts on that. Because those people, of course, cannot report, okay, I got it, because that's a legal thing to do.
Actually, it's the 6 point is treated at another center, which what happens to them.
Yeah, but treated at another center is something within the US, which I think has to be, I think I cannot say as a patient I have been treated at another center, but the other center will inform. So this one, yeah, maybe, but I guess this one is more legal, but the rest might be.
Yeah, but there is transplanted in another country.
Yes, but this is part of the official agreements between countries. There are some official agreements where you can have legal transplantations in another country. I cannot treat as the expert. But this is not if you go there and do it illegally. Okay, so much to the payments, and then I think it's 2:07, so a good time to conclude. So I am finding that an increase in the number of US waiting list kidney patients is associated with an increase in the probability of a conflict and an increase in the number of conflict-dependent 0.5 degree latitude times 0.5 degree longitude cells with a transplant center. I also find that this increase in the waiting list is associated with an increase in the probabilities that groups with a transplant center in their home region perform an attack and in the number of attacks they perform. And this is true both for the total attacks they do and for the attacks they do outside of the home region. And I find that the increase in the number of US waiting list kidney patients is associated with more suspicious payments to and from countries notorious for organ trafficking. These effects are stronger for waiting list patients with labor income and non-existent for patients who are on dialysis, at least the first two. And I conclude that this evidence is consistent with the hypotheses that non-state armed groups finance their attacks via organ trade. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for these great comments. I will try to improve the paper with all of them. And thank you very much for listening and for having me.
Yes.
Yeah, what is the time horizon of your estimation?
It's between 2010 and 2021.
Okay. So what about if these transplant centers are somewhat, so to say, collaborating these activities by other type of activities, not just kidney transplant, but they might be up for any other unofficial or illegal activity that you are simply just taking the effect, what is going together with kidney transplant. Because I think that this US kidney demand can be very easily replaced by other type of band changing variable. That's my very nasty assumption.
Yeah, I think it depends. If this other variable is also based in the US, let's say these in general, first I agree. I think these hospitals who collaborate on this might also do all kinds of other shady things. This one I agree. If they, for example, also do treatments which are linked to similar sicknesses than the sicknesses which you need a kidney for, if they do some treatment on this, then I think this I could also kind of take up this in my estimates. However, I think for any other suspicious things they do, let's say they do lasering of eyes or something like this, then this should not be correlated with the US demand for kidneys. And then I think it shouldn't be taken up by my estimates. I think in general, for sure, these hospitals might do other things. And I think the only thing I can say here is that for any activity where we can really assume that there's a relation between the kidney demand in the US and what happens at the Indian hospital, we see an effect on this. And I think my conclusion is that this is most probably explained by this transplant tourism. But I think, yes, there could always be other things going on. Yeah.
I'm thinking about whether it would support your story if your effects were heterogeneous in terms of how easy it is to get there from the US. Like, for example, whether at those territories there is an airport or there's highway or whatever.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's nice to show like that the effects are mostly at that places rather than those more secluded.
Yeah. That's actually something I'm studying right now because I've got this comment a lot, like to look at those transplant centers which are close to an airport. And I think that's something I should do, and I'm looking forward to we'll look at the result and then conclude it. I hope.
Any more questions? Thank you.
Thank you.